As mentioned earlier, our presenter is here and we will begin at 3 o'clock. We're right at 3:03, so let's begin. I just wanted to let you know that Annie Altamirano, her, has an MA in ELT and Applied Linguistics from the University of London, England. She has over 30 years experience as a teacher and a teacher trainer and has given teacher training workshops in Europe. Her main areas of interest and study are assessment for learning, the use of literature, and more specifically, poetry to develop awareness of social issues and integrating different visual media to develop critical thinking and creativity. She is currently TESL Spain's Vice President and External Liaison Officer. So thank you for joining us, Annie, all the way from Spain.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here, really.
As you know, for our dialogues, we have introductory questions, 3 or 4. We'll have a little conversation and discussion. And we ask you, please participate. After all, it is a dialogue. And if you have some wonderful ideas, share them with us. And after that, we'll go into a breakout room activity. You'll have 2 questions to discuss. Come back and share it with us. So once again, I'm going backwards, as I always do for some reason. And here are the introductory questions. The first question, Annie, how often do you use poetry in the classroom?
As much as I can. Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I do every single day or every single class, obviously. But I do try to use poetry frequently. Sometimes because it's related to the topic of a unit of work, it's related to the topic of the lesson. Some other times because it's related to an event that happened locally or internationally. Some other times just because a student, for example, wanted to bring a poem into the classroom. So we discussed it, we read the poem or we discussed the poem. So I try to use poetry in the classroom as frequently as possible.
That's amazing. Because when I think of poetry, I am thinking of myself sitting somewhere by myself and reading it silently. So the fact that somebody can bring that to you and you're able to digest it, I'm interested to see what else you want to
There's
share.
an interesting question here. Jennifer says, do you include the lyrics to music under the category of poetry? Depending. Because I wouldn't say it's a, well, actually, if we are very strict, it would be a completely separate category. But there are songs that are really beautiful. There are other songs that have a lot of content. So personally, I consider those lyrics poetry. For example, you have Leonard Cohen. I love Leonard Cohen. He had beautiful songs. There are also very popular bands. I remember a few years ago when with Metallica. Yes, Your Canadian Treasure. Imagine, for example, yes, Woman. That's a beautiful song. If you read the lyrics of Woman by John Lennon, it's beauty made into a song. Nothing Else Matters by Metallica. There are lots of songs that have really beautiful lyrics. So you also take advantage of those lyrics.
Wonderful.
And sometimes if you have a student who's good at music, who likes playing the guitar or whatever, you can ask them to put music to poems.
Shall we go to the next one?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So if you don't use poetry, could you explain why?
Well, actually, this was, I thought about this question for the teachers, because I do use poetry.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I would like to listen to the teachers who are here today and ask them if they use poetry. And if somebody doesn't, please tell me why. Yes, Erica.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a newer teacher, but in my personal life, I really enjoy literature and poetry, which is why I was so interested in this TESL dialogue. And I think one of the big reasons why I haven't thought about using poetry in my classrooms is because unfortunately, it's not a very popular medium in the mainstream, even amongst readers, I think. And so I worry about engaging my learners in a medium that they might not be familiar with or might not necessarily enjoy. And so I was wondering how you can encourage those learners who may not read poetry in their day-to-day lives and encourage them to really engage with this medium to best learn from it.
That's one of the questions that is planned for this dialogue. Yes, I will deal with that. Yeah.
I think that's a question on everyone's mind. Where do you start? So I'm looking forward to finding out.
I think that where do you start is, I wasn't a reader of poetry until some years ago. I used a lot of music and good lyrics in class. I used a lot of literature in my classes, but I didn't really use poetry because I was not a reader of poetry. I started using poetry in my classes when I became a reader of poetry. I think that first we need, and by a reader of poetry, I don't mean to say that you're going to spend the whole day reading poetry and nothing else. Of course not. But when you start reading poetry and finding authors that you like and discovering different types of poetry, because poetry is not just rhyming poetry. I, for one, I don't like rhyming poetry. I read very little rhyming poetry. I prefer free verse. But that came with time. So when you start reading poetry and you start enjoying what you read, then you are ready to begin sharing poetry with your students. But you have to begin by reading poetry yourself. And the way I started reading poetry was by reading anthologies, because it was like, okay, so where do I start? Because, the classics. Okay, I read the classics when I did my degree. And I have my loves and my phobias with the classics. But then I said, okay, there should be something else. I don't want to go on reading the classics forever. So what I started doing was getting anthologies, going to the library and looking for anthologies and reading anthologies and I like this guy. So I started writing down names and doing my research and looking for more poems by these poets that I had liked. So that's how I started reading poetry and learning about people's work.
We've got two hands up. I'm not certain who was first.
Yeah. Can I just say something before that, please? Because Jennifer Pouliot is saying sometimes she omits poetry because it confuses some students who have difficulty distinguishing sounds and words. And Jennifer Hamlin is saying, as a student in high school and college, we use poetry to reflect and learn about history. Example, Japanese encampment. We were asked to write a poem choosing from an artist's famous photographs about the period of history. It was a wonderful exercise to put yourself in the shoes of the person who was photographed. It teaches empathy too.
Absolutely, absolutely. That is something that I do. That is what I do. Two things with my students. One is reading poetry and enjoying poetry per se, and the other one is having them write poetry. And one of the ways in which I encourage them to write poetry, or I sort of move them into thinking, is with visual elements. It could be photographs, it could be a video clip. Do you find that poetry is abstract? Let's see. Well, but Susan and Megan have been.
Susan, yes.
Yeah.
They've been very patient. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
I was just going to tag on to the song idea. And it's interesting that in the Hebrew language, there's one word that means poem and song. There's only one word. It's the same thing. I think that if it comes from the students, you can ask them for a song. In fact, they could maybe pick a song that they know in their mother tongue and, have that as an assignment, even to maybe share that, to translate it.
Yeah.
So just, there's so many ideas, but thank you.
I'm writing down that reference that you gave me about the Hebrew word. I'm going to look for it.
The word is sheer. It's
Uh-huh.
in English, it's usually transliterated as S-H-I-R.
Lovely.
Okay. Thank you. I think that particularly when you have multilingual classes, it's something that I find so enriching as a teacher. You can take advantage of that and have students bring poetry from their own culture, from their own language. And that is so enriching for everyone in the class. It's like when, for example, and this is something that I've done with classes where I have students from different countries, from different cultures, and with different first languages. Suppose that we are talking about idioms in English, and then I ask them, okay, how do you say this in your language? And it's so enriching for everybody, I think. So that's wonderful. That's wonderful, Susan. Yeah.
That's great. Amazing. Thanks, Susan.
Okay, and we'll have Megan.
Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to add, so one difficulty I found, myself, I don't really read poetry either, but I am interested in using it as more of a creative element in teaching. The only thing I find difficult is trying to link it to the course content. For example, a particular grammar point or particular listening skills, trying to find material like that. I haven't been able to find a website that specifically says, okay, these songs are great for this grammar point. On occasion, I find articles about it, but not very often. So it's hard to find those resources. That's my difficulty.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there is no such website. Don't go on looking because I've tried. What I've done is look for poems and just spend time. I'm sorry, but there is no easy way here. And spending time looking at different poems and poets, sometimes that I said, this one. So what can I do with this? And sometimes that is the point I usually make when dealing with poetry is that, again, there are two, let's say, aspects of using poetry. You can use poetry to teach the language, but then you can also use poetry to teach values. So it's totally different, because when you are using poetry to teach values, you don't care so much about the grammar. What you are looking at is the meaning, not the grammar. Then, of course, if you want to use a poem to teach grammar, that's perfect. Grammar, vocabulary, listening, intonation, saying the poems aloud so that the students get familiarize themselves with the sounds of the language, with the rhythm of the poem, with the rhythm of the language. But something that is different from looking at a poem from the meaning of the poem, from the point of view of the values that the poem is teaching or is conveying. And also, what I don't do with my students is critical analysis. I leave that to the academics. I leave that to the teachers of English as a first language, to the teachers of literature. What I want the students to do is that they develop a love for poetry, not critical analysis. Because if something puts people off, it's having to look at the book, at a novel, or at a poem, and having to analyze it, enjoy. That is, my aim is to have my students enjoy poetry, enjoy an extract from a novel, enjoy a short story. And the best way of ruining the whole process is trying to engage them in critical analysis.
Yeah, it's kind of like extensive reading in a way, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
they need to
right.
enjoy the process. Okay.
That's right. When you want to do intensive reading, that is another story. That is another thing. And my aim is this, when I talk about using poetry in the classroom, is about enjoying poetry, not doing critical analysis.
Annie, I see a hand up as well. If we could take Jennifer's question.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Hi, it's just to maybe give a tip for Megan or anybody else who wants to find material related to a specific grammar or teaching point. I find it useful sometimes to just do a Google search with a sample keyword or phrase, and then add short or simple poem or lyrics in my search. So for example, if I wanted to teach negation, then I would search, just generally don't or do not, poem, short or simple. And actually that's how I came up with Imagine. I was looking for material to help teach, proper use of the word not. And it comes up over and over and over again. And it's a catchy song. The students really enjoyed it. And I got a lot of positive feedback. It was very memorable for them. And it was around Christmas time, so it was kind of a good fit. But just generally searching, or just when you're doing your own material and examples, like if you Google it often, there's so many song lyrics and poetry these days. I think it'd be hard not to be able to find something that would be relevant to what you're teaching. Anyway, I just thought I'd add that in.
Yeah, you're right.
Thank you.
Although there is no specific website where you can find that, there's a lot of poetry going on, and a lot of young poets publishing on the internet, and being published. So I think that poetry can relate much better to our students than the classics, for example.
I'd like to move a little bit forward, if I may, Annie, to the next one. Are there any other hands up? I don't see any.
No, but let me just get Sandra's question in. Sorry. Do you find that poetry's abstract qualities and metaphors are difficult for lower level learners?
Of course. It all depends on what you choose. You need to choose poems that your students can read and understand. I mean, there are some poems that are really simple, written in simple language, I mean, and they don't require a deep study of metaphor. So you will need to decide, okay, I'm going to use a poem, but with which group of students? What's the level of my students? You need to bear that in mind when you choose the poems.
Wonderful. So the
And
question,
not all poems have abstract qualities and metaphors. Some are very straightforward.
Yeah.
Next question, what are the benefits, if any, of using poetry in the ESL, EFL class?
Oh, there are many. There are many. I think I've mentioned some. One is, for example, when you read poetry aloud and when you have students reading poetry aloud, they get used to the sounds of the language, you know, to the flow of the language, to the sound of words. It also enhances vocabulary and language skills because they learn new language, they learn new vocabulary. Also, it improves poetry, helps them improve their comprehension skills because the imagery, the figurative expressions, they have to think critically about that. And also they have to, that is, of course, it all depends on how you handle all this, what you plan around the poem. But for example, you can ask them how they feel about the poem, to have mental representations of the poem. So it encourages creativity and critical thinking. It also encourages self-expression because you're asking them to respond to the poem. Yes, and if you are going to later on ask them to write, you are developing their self-expression. Also, they can respond to the poem not only orally or in writing, they can respond visually. They can create a visual representation of the poem. So it's a whole world around that. And that increases motivation, it increases engagement, and also it builds cultural understanding. So there are lots of ways in which you can use a poem to develop students' linguistic abilities. At least, well, I speak really with passion about all this because I love using poetry.
We've got Daryl's hand raised.
Oh, yes.
Here he comes. Hi, Daryl.
Hi, Daryl.
Hello, everybody. Just a comment. This is a very exciting webinar. It's so, we'd have to spend a whole year and you'd have to supply a lot of coffee. But I just want to comment that it's the most wonderful thing to use. Each of us finds a different way. Just one example, for example, the beauty of writing in many cultures transposed to poetry. I think speaking, all of us, probably many of us speak two languages.
Yeah.
Transposing a poem from the original language with its particular rhythm to the new language with its own music, I think is the most exciting thing for the brain. Also, speaking from experience with students, many of whom are poets, maybe, let's say Russia, they know Yevtushenko, Greece, maybe they even Lord Byron. But what I'm saying is, it's the rhythm of the poem is like music. If you're learning the Beatles yesterday or Eleanor Rigby, the lyrics will stay, the words will stay with you. And with repetition, and you play it at night, you'll probably wake up in the morning and you're singing it better than the composer. So what I'm saying is, it's just so multifaceted. And I'm sorry if I'm talking too much, but just listening, it's a very exciting topic, because music, music, piano, even listening to Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong for grammar, it's an amazing thing, because it's easy, and also the sense, the intention, and the feeling, SIFT, sense, intention, feeling, and tone. Mnemonic, you probably know. It's a very old one. But when somebody's reading poetry, it can really make people cry.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's a wonderful vehicle. And sometimes, with students, it can just come naturally on a Friday when you're looking at a poem, and it could be related to summer, to winter. So, listening to all of you, I had to comment, because it's familiar. You know what I mean?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daryl.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Mahmoud says that he writes poetry. Me too.
Yes, wonderful. Maybe you can share a few lines later. That would be great.
How many languages, Annie?
My mother tongue is, my first language is Spanish, but then I grew up speaking English as a second language, and then I studied French, Italian, and a little bit of Portuguese.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Wonderful. Wow.
When I said I write poetry, really, since my early years at school, I fell in love with poetry, and I fell in love with the classics and the Victorian age, and I adore the Shakespearean poetry. And if a day passes by and I don't write poetry, I feel something is missing.
Yeah.
And even I have something. When we have time, I can read you some if you like.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I love the passion that you're expressing.
Yes.
Absolutely amazing. Let's jump in and give Annie a run for her money, so to speak. What kinds of poems do you generally use?
Well, a little bit of everything. I have some things here that, for example, this is one. As I said, of course I read the classics, and I've read a lot of poetry from the 20th century, but I find the poetry that modern writers, contemporary writers write, especially the younger generations, absolutely fascinating. And there's this poet, he's Nigerian, he's called Inua Elams. This is the book, and the name of the book is The Half God of Rainfall. I think that students who like basketball will love it, because the main character is, it says, I'll read here a couple of comments. It's part Homeric style epic, part female-focused revenge tragedy. Each line feels as though it's carved into stone. Solid, striking, glinting with beauty, but steeped in hard-edged truth. It's an amazing book of poetry. Yes, it's a long poem with illustrations made by the poet himself. And I think that young teenagers and young adults will love it. The poems I generally use, as I say, they are usually poems by contemporary writers. And I try to look for poems that, particularly when I'm working with, let's say, students who do not have a high level of English, I try to look for poems that are interesting but simple, that have a language, a level of language that they can handle, although I always aim at giving something that is slightly above their level of competence, so that they are challenged and they can learn a new language from this poem. But I try to look for things that can be themes that are attractive to the students. Also, poems that are simple in the way that they are not this obscure thing that I don't even understand myself. So that's the sort of thing I look for. For example, there are some young, I'm sorry that I was telling this to Melita and Jackie the other day, and I would appreciate if you could suggest names of poets, contemporary poets, young poets that you have read and you could recommend, because I must confess that my ignorance of Canadian poets, except for Margaret Atwood and Leonard Cohen, is complete. So if you could provide me with some names that I could look up. For example, this girl, Paula Meehan, she's British. Well, she's not a girl, she's a rather, and I wouldn't say an old lady, but she's an adult. She writes beautifully. And then this other one out, I love this one. This is a girl, she's a British poet, but from an immigrant family. I like poetry by young generations, first generations or second generation British poets that come, for example, this girl is, her family is Chinese. Then there are other poets that are either Nigerian, but living in Britain for a long time. That is multicultural poetry. I like that a lot. And the younger generations of poets in Britain, for example, they are usually children of immigrant families. And the poetry they write is very close to the young people that read them. West Indian poems no, never. I'm going West Indian poems. Names, please. I'm learning from you too. Daryl has published a poem on multiculturalism. Oh, that's wonderful.
Wonderful.
Poets, okay, poets.ca. Good.
Yeah, poets.ca.
Oh, Poetry Foundation. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yes. Mary Oliver. So this is very interactive because I am learning from you.
And that's what the dialogue is all about, sharing information, exchanging.
Holy cow.
Yes, and Mahmoud, he posted his poem, so we can read it at our, our leisure.
Worcestershire. I love Worcestershire. She's amazing. She wrote that poem about home and the shark. My God, I remember listening to a colleague reading that aloud and weeping. It's good. And this girl, Amanda, I can't remember her surname. This very young lady, a very young girl, Amanda Gorman. Amanda Gorman. She's wonderful. Yeah. Ooh, I'm going to copy all this. Yeah.
I've moved to the next question, but I think you've kind of answered it in a sense, Annie. How do you choose the poems?
Okay. Well, yes, in a way, I answer that, but just to sum it up, because it was a bit chaotic. For example, if it is engaging and accessible to the students, of course, first and foremost. The potential for discussion and analysis, and by analysis, I don't mean critical analysis. Analyzing the message, what the poet wanted to say, what the students get from the poem. Also, the poem's relevance to what the students are doing in class, to the theme or the topic that they are studying. Appropriate language level. Also, I try to bring in different styles and forms of poetry so that they can perceive, they can see the diverse nature of poetry. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, many people think that poetry is rhyming poetry, sonnets. No. That is just one of the many forms of poetry. Also, the way poetry is laid out on the page. That is also important. Cultural diversity, we have been talking about that. Also, maybe to some extent, when students show interest, or when their level of English allows, we can choose classics and have a look at the historical context and the significance of these poets in English literary history. And by English, I mean the language and not the country. And your ultimate Canadian poetry list. Wow. And of course, accessibility to the resources. Now with the internet, is much easier to find things. But still, there are some poets that we may like and are not available on the internet because they don't allow their poems to be published on the internet. But those are more or less the criteria I follow. And also asking the students to bring the poems they like.
In their own language sometimes, or
Yes.
not?
Yes.
I bet you that's beautiful too, to hear it in another language.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yes. Even in languages I don't understand.
Exactly.
But the sound, I remember years ago, my daughter traveled, we were still living in Argentina because I am originally from Argentina. And we were still living there. My daughter went to the Middle East with her father. And when they were in Egypt, she bought some music for me. And she brought me a record by a singer who was the most popular one. He was like, I don't know, the Michel Bublé of the time in Egypt. And I couldn't understand a word, of course, because I don't know the language. But the music and the sound of the language was so beautiful that I started learning the songs just by phonetics. And I ended up singing some of the songs. I don't know how well I could do that, but probably if anybody who spoke Egyptian heard me, they would be horrified. But I could repeat the words because they sounded so beautiful. And I didn't know anything about the song. I didn't understand a word, but it didn't matter. It was the sound.
Wonderful.
Okay, so
Cree poetry.
yes.
We've got the chat flow. Yeah.
Yes, that
Wonderful.
question is a question from Dinah or Dina. I teach on a Cree Aboriginal reservation, grade 6.
Wow.
So getting them to read anything is a challenge, but I must also make it culturally relevant. Would legends be related to a type of poetry that I could introduce?
Yes, sometimes legends involve poetry. I'm not familiar, of course, with Cree traditions, but sometimes there are certain legends that involve poetry. You can combine the two. You can look for legends, and then I have a book somewhere. Oh, pity I didn't. A friend of mine, she's an Argentinian poet, and she has been living in New York for a long time. And she published a book some time ago. In a way, she rescued poetry from, I think, well, it's American native nations. I think it was Apache poetry. I mean, she rescued poems and translated them into, with the help of friends who spoke the original language, she translated them into English. She's a professional translator, and she created a beautiful book of poetry with the original version and the English one. So you can try to look for that, because maybe there is Cree poetry somewhere. Maybe the students don't know it because they are too young, but possibly it's something that has just come to my head this very moment. But maybe the parents or the grandparents remember poetry or songs that were never written, but they know the words. And that can be poetry. That is poetry, in a way. So you can try to look for the connection between the legends and possibly songs or poems from a long time ago.
Yeah, Meredith also had a great idea that she could ask the elders.
Nice.
That's right.
As well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Of course, there may be a poet among them. Sure.
Anything else?
The title of the book of rescued poems, give me a, let's see. Later on, when you are working in your groups, I'm going to look for the book.
Thank you, Annie. Wonderful. Shall we go on to the next question then?
Yes, please.
Yes.
What resources do you use to find engaging and appropriate poems for your students?
Okay, the internet, those pages, we have mentioned a few of them, and the books that I usually follow poets on Twitter. Twitter can be quite rubbish sometimes, but depending on what you follow or who you follow. And I tend to follow poets, writers, poets in general, and so they at the same time they follow other people, or they have friends who are poets, and sometimes they publish poems. So I start doing my research on the internet, and then I buy the books, and I read them through, and I try to find suitable poems. And another thing that I do is sometimes I bring to the class 2 or 3 different poems by 2 or 3 different poets, and I just give the poems to the students. I say, okay, have a look. What do you make of it? On Instagram, poetry is not a luxury, and Poetry Foundation, that's right, yeah. We have a lot of knowledgeable, oh yes, librarians, of course. You have an advantage because you live in a country where librarians speak English. I live in a country where librarians just speak Spanish. So if I have to find poetry in English, I need to look for by myself, because my librarians in the local, there is a very good local library here, in Salamanca, where I live. Well, there are a few libraries, but the one I am a member of, the English, let's say, section of the library is quite small. And most of the books they have there are donations that I have made. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes, Penguin Random Classics. Yes, you can, yeah. Yes, publishers usually have even English as a second language publishers, they do have collections of poems. Yes, Melita, more questions?
We do. Jackie, did you have something to add? Because you're muted right now.
No, I'm just looking here.
Just scrolling through.
Okay, Poetry Foundation offer a variety of poems across the world. Now what? Okay.
Yeah, the university, Susan, yes.
Yes. Comments, not necessarily question. I also wanted to make sure that the question, the difference between poem and it's further on. There have been so much, and thank you so much. You all have been doing great. The chat is really busy.
It's on fire, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it's hard to keep up.
But feel free, because this is a dialogue, to unmute yourself and
yes, please.
And let's hear your voices. And you've got these great ideas.
Yes, I think it was Farhana about the poetry and nursery rhymes. Erica answered. However, I just wanted to be sure that, to make sure that she got the answer that she wanted. And if not, please unmute and explain.
Well, I grew up with nursery rhymes. And as a child, I learned a lot of English, like when he was up, he was up. When he was down, he was down. When he was only halfway up, he was neither up nor down, things like that.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah. The grand old Duke of York.
Of York.
Yeah. Actually, this all stayed with me. So I was wondering if we could have those kind of nursery rhymes which are actually very useful for language in our class. Yeah.
In a way, that's the way my kids learned English.
Yeah.
That is, my kids are bilingual in Spanish and English.
Yeah.
And ever since they were very small, I read to them in English and in Spanish. And I remember using those children's books that some of them were rhymes and I don't know, other words. At the beginning, it was just picture books. And then there were books with rhymes, and they learned their rhymes. And other books were stories, but in verse form.
Yes.
So that's wonderful. There was one called "Are You My Mother?"
Yeah.
My daughter still has the book. It's torn to pieces, but she has started reading it to her children.
Yeah. Oh.
And it's a little bird who by accident falls off the nest while his mother is looking for food. And so he starts walking around. The illustrations are lovely. He starts walking around and asking all the animals that he finds, "Are you my mother?" And so the first question that my daughter learned in English was, "Are you my mother?"
Okay. That's great. Yeah.
Yes, Darren.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing. You've got a very nice voice too.
Yes.
I'm just thinking of books that our kids read, French and English. One beautiful one, which students can read. It's very beautiful, by Ludwig Bemelmans, Madeleine. About a lady who's in charge of 12 little girls, and every day she takes them walking down the streets of Paris. I think, I can't pronounce it in French, they can, Madeleine. And I'm just trying to think, there are just so many, because they also, and then I introduced, because I speak English, but I also speak Afrikaans, which is like Flemish or Dutch. So when our children were young, I would read one or two of my favorite poems in Afrikaans. And, you know, as we've said, as you've all said, you know, the rhythm of another language is so exciting. And also it's a lesson in sociology because it's indicative of the culture of the language.
Yeah.
Some languages are very, very strong, the poetry. And in French, of course, very romantic. Spanish also, very interesting, you know, listening to Spanish when my daughter speaks it, because she went to school in Burgos. Just for a while, but she came back, and when she spoke, I thought, this is not my daughter, because she, as a kid, kids take in the language so easily, but it was very beautiful listening to her speak. And then later when she was teaching in Turkey, the Turkish language as well, didn't understand a word, but it's all these languages have got a certain, it's like going into a restaurant, you know, different tastes.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Shel Silverstein, oh yes, of course. And also, where is it? Michael Rosen, he's British. And this is this collection is called Michael Rosen's A to Z, the best children's poetry from Agar to Zephaniah. She, it's this one here. He asked poets to write a poem beginning with each letter of the alphabet. And there is a poem for each letter of the alphabet.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and they are all children's poems for children.
That brings us to our last question before the breakout rooms. What are some of the challenges in using poetry to teach values and ethics in an English language class?
I think that the biggest challenge can be that students misunderstand what we are trying to do, or rather, sometimes it's the parents who misunderstand what we are trying to do. Sometimes you may need to ask for permission because parents may think that you are, in a way, perhaps, depending on the nature of the poem, of course, parents may think that you are invading competencies. That is, that you are trying to indoctrinate or whatever. It can happen. Another challenge is the lack of relevance. Some students may not relate to the poems or to the themes of the poems, and they may not see the practical application in everyday life. Some students are like that. They need to have a practical application for everything. Also, the lack of engagement. The poem may be too difficult for the students, too difficult to understand, or the language might be too difficult, so they are not motivated to engage with the poem. Limited time. Normally, teachers are always pressed for times because there are so many things to cover during the school year, and you just don't have time. You can always put a little poem here and there. As I say, it's not doing critical analysis. It's just using the poem for other purposes. Some students may be resistant to poetry because they think that poetry is rhyming poetry and something of the past. Okay, you can bring some raps. raps can be poetry. Of course, be careful with the lyrics.
Oh, you're talking rap music. I was thinking enchilada.
No, rap music. I'm sorry, rap music.
No,
yeah.
it's my bad.
No, it's rap music. For example, I remember years ago. Do you remember? Well, many people here are too young to remember this film, probably. Dangerous Minds.
Mhm.
A film about this white literature teacher who goes to teach in a Chicago inner city school with very difficult students. It's a fantastic film. And I remember showing that film to my students who were at the time 17. And the music is Gangsta Paradise by Coolio.
Uh-huh.
A fantastic song. It's a rap. It's a rap song, and it has a lot of cultural connotations. And so, of course, I had to explain the cultural connotations to the students, but they were really interested. And from then on, although it was a difficult, let's say, following the lyrics with the music was quite difficult, but they were delighted later on, because that is, once they saw the lyrics and they understood the references, they were very happy, because it was, in those days, that song was very popular in Argentina. So at last, they understood what the song said. And they could compare the environment and what the song said with the life of the deprived areas of Buenos Aires. So we established a parallel, and then a few days later they watched Dead Poets Society.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
So I used Dead Poets Society as an excuse to give them, oh, Captain, my Captain. So, and we compared the two different settings. So we had the film, the song, the poems in Dead Poets Society. I brought in a bit of Shakespeare, so we had a whole melange there. But I noticed that from then on, they were more receptive to poetry, because they understood that poetry is not just the sonnets written by an old man who died a long time ago.
Okay, Jennifer is saying one of the challenges is also making sure that you research the poet's background and the context,
of course,
of their work. Yeah, especially in regards with hidden meanings, as sometimes there can be very controversial messages and connotations conveyed through association with political or other beliefs that are not always obvious.
Of course. That's why it's very important that we read poetry and we are careful what we choose. Yes, I absolutely agree. As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life. Yeah, I love it. Yeah. West Indian Caribbean poets. Jamaica Kincaid. Yeah, I know that one. Yes.
And I think Louise Bennett too is one of the Jamaican poet.
Ooh, I have to do a lot of research here. You are giving me homework.
Fabulous contributions. Wonderful.
Yes,
very
fantastic.
knowledgeable,
this session is so enriching.
Yes,
absolutely.
So enriching. I'm so happy. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions in particular you wish to ask before we go into the breakout rooms? I want to know who is your favorite poet, Annie? If you had to choose.
Okay, it's quite difficult to choose. But for example, my favorite female living poet is Caroline Duffy. She's she was born in Scotland, and she was Britain's Poet Laureate for 10 years until 2 or 3 years ago. Also, Benjamin Zephaniah. Benjamin Zephaniah is Jamaican originally. But he was born in Birmingham, but Eurydice by Caroline Duffy, yes, and originally, I will talk about originally in the webinar in a few days. Benjamin Zephaniah, he's fabulous. I think that Benjamin Zephaniah is the kind of poet, because he's also a performer, he's also a musician, he's the kind of poet that teenagers and young adults would like. I think that those two, and Jackie Kay, she's also British. Well, I would say those are my 3 favorites in English.
Thank you.
Then there are lots of others.
I bet.
Yes,
I bet
yes.
there are.
Also in Spanish or in French. I mean, well, I don't read that much in French these days. I don't have time. But in Spanish, there are lots of poets that I like. Yes.
Thank you so much for that. Anything else in the chat before we break into our groups?
Claude McKay.
Yes, yes. Just some of the people, Claude, Eurydice by Caroline
Duffy, yes.
Yeah. And Nawati says, if you do a little historical review of the timelines of the era that the poem is written, can also be interesting for students.
Yeah, totally agree, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jackie. Usually we have one question, but we wanted to see how 2 questions were for you in the breakout rooms. You may choose one or both. The first one being, what techniques do you find to be most effective for teaching students to appreciate poetry? And the other one, what are some strategies for integrating poetry into language lessons to promote the development of values and ethics in students? So some really good questions for you to debate over and discuss. Just want to, are there any other questions before we do that?
Just one, and it could come out in the breakout room, and it's how to help students generate free verse. Meredith, I'm assuming that would mean like to add on to the poem, to be able to create you know, a part of it, or you know, make it their own, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, Jackie, like I've had success with rhyming poetry because I can offer a form for them to fill in. But when it comes to free verse, I feel less secure.
Well, let's see. Let's do something. Add that question to your conversation in the breakout rooms. And then after I don't know how long they are going to be in the breakout rooms, but then we can discuss as a group. And I will tell you what I do.
Okay, thank you.
I don't want to influence you. There are lots of people. I think that all of you like poetry or read poetry or are interested in using poetry and have a lot of excellent ideas. So I would like to hear your ideas, and then I will tell you mine.
All right. On that note, let's see what I have created for you. How was your discussion? Would anyone like to go first? You could unmute yourself, or
we needed a bit longer.
I know.
The 2 ladies didn't get a chance. I started talking, and then, but
my apologies.
Maybe next time.
Well, we'll keep that in mind. Usually our breakout rooms the time goes by so quickly. So thank you. Yeah. Who would like to go first? Anyone? So let's start with the
Shall I?
question. What techniques do you find to be most effective for teaching students to appreciate poetry? Do you have a comment on that one, maybe?
I can go. This is Dina.
Oh, thank you. Dina, thank you so much.
No worries. I think for me, especially because where I am, I'm in such a unique situation, like being up in northern Quebec and on a Cree reservation. For me, the idea of introducing these things is definitely finding topics that they can relate to and that they would be interested in. So for me, it's all about nature and it's all about animals. It's all about being on the outdoors. So if I could find poetry that have that kind of theme and that kind of storytelling behind it, I think that would be a good entryway to get my kids interested in actually wanting to read poetry and to actually engage with it. So for me, that's the topics. It's what the poetry is about. Could be a great way for one of the definite techniques you could use tonight to get people engaged, finding out who your target audience or who your students are and finding out what their interests are. And that way you can kind of get in there and then start from there.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anyone else on that one? No? Strategies for integrating poetry into language lessons to promote the development of values and ethics of students. Thank you.
So strategies. We discussed strategies, and we thought of one because we looked for time like Christmas. At Christmas time, we use a lot of poetry and songs, and we develop language through that. Like, for instance, description, how to describe. So describe Santa, things like that. And then in the poetry also, we use that. So it is the time also. It's the time of the year also, which helps us. And that's one strategy for integrating poetry into language lessons. So that's one strategy that we discussed.
That's great. Annie?
Yeah, I like that. I mean, for example, having the student write poems. Once they have read a poem, and that's something that I'm going to show in the webinar in a few days. Once we have worked with the poem, encouraging them to write their own poem in response to what they have written, to what they have read, I'm sorry. Also doing poetic storytelling. And there you can use the legends, yes? That is encouraging them to use poems to tell stories or find poems that tell stories. And I'm going to show you one in the webinar. Sometimes you find these poems that are presented as a story, but they are really a poem. So doing this poetic storytelling, yes. Also having a poem as role models, showing empathy, understanding, multicultural understanding with the characters. Sometimes for the little children, for example, for small children, you can do that with lovely poems that involve animals or cartoons or fictional characters. And so you present role models, positive role models and positive attitudes, incorporating visual aids, having the students, as I mentioned at the beginning, having the students react to the poem in different ways with visual representations, presenting the poems through visuals, for example. So those are in many ways simple techniques that you can use to introduce the poems and to integrate the poems in the language classroom, and also to introduce the values, the ethics that we want to our students to explore.
Susan?
Something that we talked about for even lower level learners, you can scaffold by doing giving a sentence stem and maybe even filling in a blank. You could even take a poem and then maybe white out some words and have even just having different students fill in their own word and see out in the classroom can be very exciting.
Well, actually, I have an activity with a poem by E.E. Cummings doing that.
So definitely, if you have a chance to sign up for the webinar, it'll be a little bit more hands-on maybe as well, Annie.
Oh, yes, yes, because I'm going to show the actual activities.
Right, right.
And of course, it's ideas, things that I've done, but you can contribute with lots more. The book.
Oh, yes.
Darren, unfortunately, the copy that I have, I thought I had the 2 copies because there are 2 copies, 2 versions of the book. The one in the original language and the English translation, and the one translated from English into Spanish. And I have the one that is translated into Spanish because this is the one that my friend sent me from New York. And it's called, in Spanish, it is called Cántico de la Noche. That is the song of the night.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, it's Cántico. I'm going to write it in the chat.
Perfect.
Let me check here. Here we are. And that is the name of the poet.
Mercedes.
Mercedes Roffey.
Okay. I'm going to send it to my daughter. Thank you so much.
She will love it, I'm sure.
She'll read it. The Spanish I'll send her.
Yeah, and also it's interesting because it has, Mercedes has copied, you see, art from the original versions. Oh, Megan, you have to go. Thank you for coming.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you
Yes.
so much. We're coming to the ending. If we could just get the script up, Jackie, that would be great.
Okay, perfect.
Annie, you are a wealth of information. I thank all of you for participating today. It's very difficult to be alone with crickets around, but thank you so much.
It's been an amazing
It's
session.
amazing,
Thank you.
amazing, amazing people, amazing passion for this topic as well. Check out our webinar. It's coming up with Annie. Your certificates will be mailed to you as always. Thank you. Maybe Annie, you could leave us with a couple of lines from the book as people are slowly leaving us. And
From this one?
Okay.
the
From
one you
Cántico?
like. Do you mind?
I will read from Cántico.
Thank you.
I will read in English.
Sure.
Wish. Now he thought, at a certain place from which the air is moving around everywhere, they will breathe easily by it while walking around on this earth. Now, this is happening just the way he thought it to be happening. Now, this time of day, we give thanks for the air, for the place with the net on it, which is making the air move everywhere on earth. This is the way it should be in our minds.
Thank you. You're right. It's just something just tickles that old heartstring.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
It is
beautiful.
truly
Yes.
beautiful. Thank you all. We're going to end it here. Blessings to you. Keep safe, keep well.
Okay.
Keep your hopes up. Yes, Jackie.
Oh, okay. I just wanted them to let them know that they'll get the email, take up to 7 days, and that there'll be a survey in a few business days. And please fill it out. Let us know what you thought about the webinar. And hurrying along here, we have 2 TESL dialogue session coming up. Montessori learning in an online context. That's by Jessica Leslie. And the other one is Online Learning from a Learner's Point of View, and that's March 7th. Ellen Park. Okay, so once again, thank you very much. Great participation. I learned a lot about poem. It was fantastic.
Yes.
And thank you, Annie. Yes. Yes. Awesome.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Jackie. Bye, Nora.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Melita.
Oh.
We'll see you soon. Blessings to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.